Welcome to Sleep, Sex, and Senility, where we unpack the surprising connection between how you sleep, how you feel, and how your brain and body function over time.
Before we begin, a quick note. This podcast is for educational purposes only and does not provide medical advice. Please consult your own healthcare provider for recommendations specific to you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kathleen Carson. Welcome back to Sleep, Sex, and Senility. Today, we are going to talk about ancient inflammation. It's a story of teeth, vessels, and human evolution, and it's based on a recent research article called Imaging the Past.
I'm Dr. Ellie Campbell, and we're so thrilled that you've joined us again for another episode. I personally have a vocational interest in paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases based on their skeletal remains. I took a course on this in my graduate training and have been kind of a mummy junkie ever since. I like to know what is it that we can learn from skeletal remains. And there's quite a bit, not only anthropomorphics, we can measure size and distance between certain bones and whether this skeleton was likely Asian, Black, or Caucasian in origin. We can look at the remains and what diseases leave telltale signs. Scurvy and syphilis and tuberculosis and leprosy all leave skeletal signs. And it's really interesting to comb through the skeletons and mummified remains of humans to learn about what diseases plagued us then and how that might be relevant to us today. And these university professors out of the Vanderbilt University in Nashville went to Cairo Museum and spoke to them to get permission to CAT scan some mummies that they had. And so, Kathleen, tell us what they found.
Well, first, I want to say I did not know that you were a mummy junkie. That is so cool. One of my favorite classes in dental school was dental forensics. And I loved the idea that you could x-ray people later, and find out maybe who they were, what problems they had, what might show up in their jaws and bones. But I was just looking at that from a, identify the bodies standpoint, not, going all the way back in time to talk about mummies. And yeah, very cool. Learn something new about you all the time. But what really fascinated me was one, they're looking at dental decay, and they had dental decay. The mummies had dental decay. They had periodontal bone loss. They had periapical infections, and then they had calcified blood vessels. And so they were able to look and make connections as to, if there may have been an oral systemic connection way back then, which I'm sure we'll get into that in details. But to me, what was so interesting is all these dental issues existed back then, but there were no refined diets, really. I mean, they had a little bit of refined diet, maybe a little bit of sugar and honey and
Dates. Ooh.
and dates, right? But nothing like we do today. But they had attrition, the wear was such a problem, but it wasn't stress and grinding. It was sand that was in their food because of how they were processing their wheat. Decades of chewing on sand particles created a problem, but it also developed their jaws. So they got the benefits of wide jaws, but they ended up with these dental abscesses, infections, periodontal disease, and these problems that I think we often consider modern day problems, but they go way back. They're just different root causes back then than now. So
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. So let's talk about one thing that they didn't see a lot of in those jaw bones of those mummified human specimens. One of those things they did not find very often was impacted wisdom teeth. Right. So let's talk about that briefly, because I think that as a parent, I think I'm doing all the right things for my modern care of my children. And so that means a bottle feeding and baby food.
Right.
Versus what traditional cultures did with nursing and with chewing on hard, gnarly things. Kids had bones to chew on. They didn't have pacifiers made of rubber. Kids had hard sticks that they would chew on, literally, instead of toothbrushes, chew on sticks. And so from a developmental dentistry perspective, what changes in my mouth happen bottle feeding versus breast and chewing hard foods versus soft? What changes in my face?
Well, your bone structure and how your body compensates. So if you're putting those forces that are needed to develop your jaw and your maxilla into a stronger, broader structure, eating the harder things, using your muscles, activating the force in there. But that's where this was so interesting. So I often also talk to parents about, the baby-led weaning diet, introducing the sticks and the bones and not giving them the baby food, limit the sugars because that is modern day problems. But going back here to this study, they also had systemic inflammation issues from their teeth, but it wasn't because they didn't have big, broad structures. That's what they were doing right. They had other things that were causing it. So one of the things to take away from this is, the diet, the nutrition, what we're doing for our kids, not giving them pacifiers, that's going to change the structure of the face as well. We want to do things that encourages the broad development of the maxillofacial complex, basically, not only to help with enough room for the teeth, but that's going to develop the nasal cavity. It's going to give a better jaw position and function. It's going to help people avoid things like sleep breathing issues and TMJ issues.
Not to mention orthodonture later
Oh, that's
as a
true.
teenager, right?
I don't know, that's good for the
Right.
dental business though, right? Take
Right,
away
but
all our income.
parents, if you don't wanna spend 10 grand straightening your kids' teeth as teenagers, start as a baby purposefully feeding them in a way that allows them to really use their jaw muscles.
Yep.
Because when we do that, we grow literally a bigger mid face and a bigger jaw, prevents many problems later in life, but not all, which is
Right.
what surprised us about this article when they CAT scanned these mummies' faces
Yeah.
and found out that they had a lot of cavities. But
Yeah,
those cavities were mostly because they were chewing bread made with sand, and they
yep,
ground the enamel off their teeth, so they didn't have a thick layer of protection. So
right.
if caries bacteria, cavity bacteria got in their mouths, they had a really easy portal of entry because they had worn off the thick enamel protection because of a diet made with what they had locally in Egypt, which was wheat grown and ground in grist mills that happened to have sand.
Right. So, their teeth were worn down, but at least they all fit. Pros and
Right. They
cons.
all fit in their mouth and they didn't need to have braces and they didn't need to have their wisdom teeth pulled out like we do because our jaws are too small for them.
Yeah.
As a parent, if I want to not have to have my kids' wisdom teeth pulled and not have to pay for braces, I start as an infant working with an enlightened dentist and orthodontist who are familiar with ways to grow a child's face.
Mhm. Yeah, the eating the foods, the increasing the nasal breathing, the correct tongue posture, limiting the sugars, but getting rid of the mouth breathing. All of those factors are important. But with what I was gonna say with the mummies, with this article that recently came out just last year, they pulled on an older study that talked about the calcifications in, the vascular arteries that were present and the vascular disease that was showing up on those scans as well. And, that's interesting because you hear about modern life leading to cardiovascular disease issues and these problems, but clearly there were things in ancient times, our physiology is the same, so, what do you think the inflammatory issues were then that were causing those cardiovascular plaques to build up?
Right. So today's modern inflammatory triggers are obvious to us, right? We eat ultra processed food. We get exposed to too much psycho emotional stress. We get exposed to sugars at an ungodly rate, seed oils that are inflammatory, maybe electromagnetic radiation and Wi Fi and cell towers and all that are triggers of inflammation. We don't get sleep the way that is in sync with Earth. But back then, they didn't have electricity, so they were in sync with light. They didn't have EMFs. They didn't have ultra processed food. So we take away all these things. What stressors did they have? Well, they certainly had infections, right? We know
Yep.
for certain that they had a lot of infectious diseases because modern plumbing hadn't been invented and we had issues as much as they tried in ancient Egypt to channel away human waste from the living quarters. There was still always a risk of fecal oral contamination, hepatitis, and gastroenteritis of various kinds. When you don't have access to IV fluids, one gastroenteritis could be fatal.
Yeah.
So not like in today's day and age where, you get dehydrated, you go to the urgent care, you get a liter of fluids and you're good to go. That wasn't available. So I think infection was a big thing. Certainly starvation, intermittent
Mhm.
starvation was a big risk for people. Intermittent fasting's good, but too many days on end with no food, starvation was a major stressor. Certainly childbirth was a major stressor without good modern care. Many women died in childbirth as a stressor. And I think we saw traumas, physical traumas from their very physical lifestyle, whether they were paid workers or slaves remains to be determined. I think there's leading evidence that suggests those Egyptian pyramids were built probably by well-paid craftsmen rather than by slaves, which has been the narrative for all this time. But I think new evidence may be shifting that pendulum. Regardless, very, very dangerous jobs, dangerous risk of getting trapped and scraped and amputations and all those sorts of stressors, I think, existed. And then the big one that we did not expect was periodontal infections. That was a big shock to these mummy
They
researchers.
they found
They did
abscesses
not
and bone
expect
loss.
mummy gummies,
Yeah,
the
right?
gums of the mummies,
Right?
to have problems, right? They did not expect that. We thought that was a modern concern. It turns out it really isn't.
If we go back to them wearing their teeth down with basically sand, and the severe attrition they found in these mummies, and they had the same structure of teeth as we do. So can you imagine the pain? I mean, have you had a toothache? That hurts. And so they're wearing them
Yeah.
down and they're exposing pulp chambers. I mean, that's what they're showing on these x-rays is they're exposing pulp chambers and the bacteria are getting in there and causing the apical infections. And so I thought it was super interesting
So
because then
talk
they
about
look deeper.
dental pain as a stressor,
I know. I mean, ouch, that has to really hurt. And yes, and
right?
they had the sugar in the form of dates, and maybe some honey, but that was about it. And the link, though, that they found, I found it really interesting that the article goes into making the connection between the plaques in the arteries and the infections in the teeth. And was there a connection? And there was, when you look at just the data by itself, there was a really strong connection. But then they made an adjustment and they corrected for age because just like, let's say you drink coffee and you have increased in plaques. It doesn't mean the coffee caused the increase in plaque, right? And it could be an age related thing. And so when they factored in for age and sex, they found that there wasn't a connection. However, there was the only reason that was is because there was this one crazy outlier that had all these apical infections, all the terrible teeth, but zero plaques in his arteries. And he skewed all of that data over that way. So they removed just that one outlier and then all the connections came back. It became super strong again. So, the causes of dental disease and maybe atherosclerotic plaques and stress and, inflammation may have changed like our root causes, but the connections have been there all along, and I think
Right.
that was a key takeaway here.
Yeah. And I think that it's an important point to make that we're so used to living in our oral systemic world and being so familiar with this. I think going back for a brief explanation of the fundamentals is worthwhile taking here. And that is that we're supposed to have bacteria in our mouth. We
Mhm,
do not want to go in there with napalm or
mhm,
mouthwashes with alcohol, annihilate all of our mouth bacteria. That is not healthy. We need those bacteria to make nitric oxide and to keep the friendly bacteria, keep the bad bacteria away.
right,
So we want healthy, friendly bacteria. When we get pathogens in our mouth, however, those pathogens typically go in a certain order and they come in one after the other, and then they develop into what's called a red complex with several bacteria that are known to not only cause gum disease, bleeding gums, wiggly teeth, tooth loss, periodontal disease, periodontitis, periodontal infections. Not only that, but these same bacteria get in the bloodstream, get in the lymphatics, crawl up and down the trigeminal nerve into the brain, crawl down the vagus nerve into the gut, and can lead to, at last count, 57 different systemic chronic illnesses that are related to these mouth bacteria.
oh
What
gosh.
happens in the mouth doesn't stay in the mouth. And we're learning now that this has been true since antiquity. This has
Yeah.
been true since at least 3,000 years ago, that these
Mhm.
mouth bacteria that they saw caused clear oral problems, tooth infections, bone
Mhm.
loss in the gums, cavities called caries in the dental world. All these conditions present in the mouth, what they were shocked to find was a high correlation of atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries in the carotids seen on those CAT scans of those heads that they were
Yeah.
looking at. It was a big surprise to them. It's not a
Mhm.
surprise to us in the
No.
oral systemic world. I see it all the time in my practice. I screen for plaque in the arteries, and if I find it, especially if I have blood markers of inflammation, including high sensitivity C reactive protein,
Mhm.
myeloperoxidase, LP-PLA2, galectin
Mhm.
3, or proBNP, these are markers of inflammation. And if I find them
Mhm.
and I have neck plaque, I'm getting my patient to the dentist for a deep dive evaluation. I need to know what's the source of that inflammation that's causing the plaque. Can we find it? And
Right.
very, very, very often it is a dental source. There is a
Mhm.
hidden infection, either gum disease, sometimes not the whole mouth, sometimes just
Mhm.
one or two pockets. But these bacteria, every time they chew, they're leaching these bacteria into the bloodstream, increasing the lipopolysaccharide load that's in the blood that causes this inflammatory
Mhm.
cascade that causes damage to the blood vessels that leads to the plaques, the cholesterol molecules sticking and forming plaque. So we have seen this connection in modern day, and we thought it was because of modern inflammation.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting. It's, to your point, our systems are the same. The bacteria that are, we have a healthy balance of bacteria when we are in a good balanced microbiome, and that has existed forever, right? That goes way back to
Right.
ancient times. That hasn't changed. And then the inflammation that they suffered, infection, inflammation, damage, illnesses, parasites, everything that you covered, infection, trauma, all of it, that can cause an early death for them. And the gum disease and the oral bacterial diseases that can be the bad bugs that can get in and cause inflammation, those existed then too. The causes of them
Right.
getting in might be different, but the actual impact of the inflammation was still there even back then.
Right. Even though they had a substantially shorter lifespan, right? The
Right.
average lifespan in ancient Egypt was 40 or 50.
Right.
So compare that to today. We get to live a much, much longer life. Sadly, many of us suffer the last 40 or 50 years of our lives with symptoms of chronic inflammation because a good, robust inflammation response is necessary. We don't want anybody to leave here thinking that inflammation is always bad. In
Right.
fact, it's not. Inflammation is very good. If you get a parasite infection or you cut your finger off, we want some inflammation. We want your body to respond in the appropriate way, hard and fast. Get these immune
Mhm.
system revved up, tanked up, fight this infection, keep the infections gone, keep them from getting infected and or clear them away. We need that a robust immune response. We need that inflammation as part of a healing
Mhm.
response.
Mhm.
But it's supposed to be a quick sprint. It's not
Right.
supposed to be a marathon. And if that inflammation goes on for years and years and decades, then we get chronic illnesses related to it that we suffer today.
Mhm.
Diabetes, cancer, heart disease, strokes
Mhm.
and their sequelae, all the autoimmune things that you can name, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, autoimmune thyroid disease, on and on and on. So, inflammation is good for a short term, not
Mhm.
good for the long term. And our mummies were seeing inflammation even in their short lifespans, often related to the fact that they wore their teeth out because of their diet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that brings up an interesting point because, if you're only living to a lifespan of 35 to 50, maybe at most, that inflammatory response that our body has, which we need to have to help us heal, to fight infections, to, help us get back into balance, that's really important. And the faster our bodies can react to that, the better off we were, in those ages. But when that becomes a chronic stimulation, day after day after day, sitting in traffic or answering emails that maybe you don't want to get to, whatever it might be, then that adds up to a chronic issue that our body's not designed to continue to fight, and that inflammation becomes a problem. So what was maybe good then turns into something that's not so great to keep us alive to, 80 or 90, leads
Right.
to other issues. So what do you think we should do, Ellie? What do you think the key points are? How can we help ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we need to go back to our fundamentals, right? We want to
Mhm.
eat clean food, ideally not laced with sand or stool bacteria or other environmental toxins that are going to make us sick, right? So eat
Yeah.
clean food. And in today's day and age, that means you have to choose organic, wild caught, no hormones, no pesticides. Keep it as clean as you possibly can because the stressors that made their food bad for them then are different than the stressors that make our food bad for us today. Eat clean
Mhm.
food. Drink clean water. We take advantage of the fact that we can go to a tap and get pretty clean water. Back then, getting clean water meant drawing it from a well far, far away from where people were living, carrying it
Mhm.
for miles. It was a big deal. Or rerouting the Nile, which they did, right, in order to get
Yeah.
access to water.
Yeah.
So drink clean water, exercise most days of the week. We have such sedentary lifestyles that we have to make time in our day to schedule. That wasn't an issue for ancient Egyptians. They were
Right.
physically active from the moment they woke up until they went to bed at night. Speaking of which, getting a good 8 hours of sleep in the dark
Mhm.
is practically impossible in today's day and age. We don't have dark skies anymore. We're full of ambient light. We've abandoned our circadian rhythm and we're not getting deep restorative sleep in the way that we used to. And because over 70% of us are overweight or obese in today's world, we carry this extra weight that increases the pressure on our chest, that increases the
Yeah.
pressure on our belly and diaphragm, increases our risk for sleep disordered breathing. And now we're not getting oxygen to our brains at night while we're
Mhm.
sleeping. So, getting deep restorative sleep and getting it measured to make sure that you
Mhm.
know that you are getting deep restorative sleep with enough
Mhm.
oxygen is a really important health strategy. I
Yeah.
think we underestimate the value of being in community and having a purpose in our life and gratitude. These were easy when you lived in a small community and much harder when you're driving through bumper to bumper to bumper traffic for 2 hours to get to what
Right.
should have taken you 20 minutes,
Right.
right? It's hard to be in
Yeah.
that relaxed state. So, spending time purposefully
Mhm.
unplugging, getting rid of the social media influences, I think, is a huge stress, especially for young people who live on social media, only watching the highlight reels of other people's lives and not realizing that once that reel is off, they have a life very much like yours, but they
Mhm.
don't show that to anybody.
Mhm.
They still cry and hurt and argue and fight and don't wear makeup and
Mhm.
right.
Yeah. All
And
of it.
so I think though all those normal life things are hidden from young people in social media today. So they spend their whole life trying to catch up and be perfect all the time. And it's not realistic and it's not reasonable. And it causes more deep seated stress that pushes your immune system into a state of inflammation chronically.
Yeah.
So
So
I
yeah.
think we go to fundamentals. There's lots of supplements we can take and drugs and peptides and bioregulators and all these
Yeah.
things that are on the list, but none of them are as effective if you don't focus on the fundamentals.
Well, and 3,000 years later, your mouth is still capable of getting the body in a lot of trouble. So you got to focus on your oral health too.
Yeah,
It's a huge source of inflammation that's chronic and underdiagnosed and not recognized and not painful. So paying attention to that and making sure your oral
that's
microbiome
why
is
we
balanced.
made this podcast,
Uh-huh.
is because
Yep.
our mouths are so intimately connected to the rest of our body that if we don't pay attention to that connection, we will never be optimally well. And we wanted to get the message out there that people recognize that from antiquity to today, a healthy mouth makes a healthy body, and an unhealthy mouth can lead to 57 or more systemic conditions, most of which are treatable if we start by focusing on oral health.
Mm. Yeah. And we just want to reduce the overall inflammatory burden that seems to be prevalent in today's modern world. Dr. Campbell, thank you for all of the tips and tools that you gave us on how we can help do that.
Well, thanks. I'm so excited we shared this interest in this article because my little paleopathology brain went crazy when I read it, and I'm so happy that it was of interest to you as well. And I
Yeah, well,
hope our
I
audience.
can't wait for the next article. I mean,
I know.
yes,
I can't wait for the
we can
audience.
just,
We'll put the link to the article at the bottom of
yeah,
the show notes so they can actually read the scientific journal from the American Dental Association
right.
on this very important subject. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Kathleen Carson.
And I'm Dr. Ellie Campbell with Sleep, Sex, and Senility.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Sleep, Sex, and Senility. For more information, such as show notes, links to anything we talked about, and other episodes, please visit us on our website at sleepsexandsenility.com. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Nanoverse Media, making the world smaller.